Um, what I want to be talking to all of you about tonight is organizing product teams and the impact that can have on how you build products, but also how you can leverage the organization of your product teams to adapt to change. A lot of this, what I'll be sharing, is based on that time spent together with Tim at Etsy over a 6-year period. And I'll start with some background about myself, and then we'll move into kind of the context behind why I thought this topic would be a good one to share with all of you, and then some of the core concepts, and then how we got to that core concept, because it wasn't something that just kind of arrived overnight, and then applications of that framework and kind of what we learned at Etsy at other companies, pitfalls to avoid, and then some closing considerations. And then I look forward to kind of continuing the conversation through Q&A at the end. So just to start a little bit about me, and thanks Tim for the intro. He covered Artifact Uprising. We're a consumer technology company based here in Denver, Colorado. I've been there for about 1.5 years, and I lead their product and engineering team. In Artifact Uprising, we help people honor and kind of celebrate the meaningful in their lives by taking the photos out of the digital shoebox in the sky or wherever they may exist and bring them into real life through premium photo products. Over the last 20 years, I've been building internet products. And I think the last 15 really focused on consumer products. And this is just sort of some places I've worked over the last 15 years. Coming out of college, and sort of my first job was as a front-end technology engineer. So I kind of started in engineering and then moved into design roles, and then into product management, and then into product leadership. I've been here in Denver for 3 years. We moved out from Brooklyn with my wife and 2 young kids. And I was really blessed before moving out here to be able to spend that time at Etsy, again, from about 2011 to 2017. And during that time period, it was a time of, I would say, constant change. Change was eternal. And when Tim and I joined, we had about 200 people at the company. And over a 6-year period, we grew to over 1,000. Came back down to mid-700s after a couple of rounds of layoffs. And when we started, the company was doing about 350 million in sales on the platform. And then over that 6-year period, grew to well over 3 billion in sales over the platform. So tons of growth. We would reorg, I would say, probably once a year. And so there were lots of opportunities to learn about how to organize. And when Tim first reached out to me about a month ago around sharing and talking about, or what I would talk about, I was sort of reflecting on, well, what would be relevant? What would resonate now? And the conditions that we're in, the macro conditions where change is kind of always a constant if you're in products and you're in technology, but it's even more so now. And then also the fact that we're towards the end of Q3, heading into Q4, and I can only imagine there are a lot of you out there who are in the thick of planning for 2011. And so I was reflecting on that. So change, you're in the midst of planning. And then also some recent success that we had at Artifact Uprising by organizing our own product and engineering team based on some of the frameworks I'll be sharing with you today. And so I thought, well, what can help all of you? What has helped me create focus, adaptability, and resiliency with product teams and with product development teams when change is constant? And I reflected back on my time at Etsy, and some of the frameworks that we developed around how to organize teams fit that. And also that those frameworks could then be applied to other places that have been since Etsy. And so that's what I want to share with you today. And that's kind of why I felt why it mattered and why it mattered now. And really the core concept is around this notion of groups and squads and how you can find resiliency through your organizational structure that balances both durability and adaptability. And as I mentioned before, we didn't arrive at this on day one. There was a lot of iteration, there was a lot of learning, and there were a lot of mistakes along the way. But we did arrive at something that effectively created this framework that even when there were future changes around organizational structure, the structure itself and like how we organize ourselves remained the same. But where Etsy did start, and my hope is this is where a lot of you are operating right now, is that cross-functional teams are really the atomic unit of product development. And so cross-functional team is usually a PM, a designer, several engineers, an engineering lead, and depending on the company, you may have some other disciplines in there, product marketing manager, an analyst, a researcher. And again, your ratios will vary, but this is just like kind of an example of like averages during our time at Etsy. And this model of small individual teams scales easily. And it did scale easily for Etsy. And that's kind of how Etsy sort of grew its product teams in the early days. And again, when I say product teams, I'm really talking about those cross-functional product development teams. So it's not just product management or product design, but product management, design, engineering. And we kind of doubled down on it. And we scaled it to nearly 50 teams, optimizing for individual autonomy. And while I think we achieved that goal, we also had real challenges when we scaled to nearly 50 discrete individual teams. And what was challenging was that alignment was challenging. And it wasn't always clear what all the work across all these disparate teams added up to. And if the work or the outcomes were achieved for a given team, how would they reconstitute and reform to do something new? And so those were some of the challenges that we faced. But also when you kind of surveyed all these different teams, natural groupings existed in areas of investment. And so what started to emerge was identifying groups focused on areas of longer term investment. For example, say, buyer experience within Etsy. And now you can organize these groups by a variety of dimensions, and we did. It could be around customer types. It could be around areas of the product experience. It could be around areas of the customer journey, around KPIs. But probably the big first shift was this notion of moving away from discrete, small, autonomous teams into identifying what are areas of longer term investment for the company, certainly from a product development perspective. And then within that, we layered in teams within the groups, and the teams within the groups represented current areas of investment. And so for example, a group, say like buyer experience, may be responsible for buyer experience on Etsy. But there's no way that that group and everyone in it could invest in every area that they're responsible for at any given point in time. And so the teams, like the sub-teams within the group, represented those current areas of investment. Maybe we'll invest in the listing page. Maybe we'll invest in navigation. But maybe it'll shift to something else over time. And so what that combination of groups and teams gave us was the ability to focus more, because you're focused on a given area of responsibility. And within that, maybe a more specific area of responsibility. And so you had durability with the groups, but then also paired that with adaptability with the teams. And so that yielded greater resiliency. So if things changed, you didn't have to scratch everything. Maybe you just adapted within the teams. And it also yielded greater alignment, because instead of like say 50 discrete teams, you had teams that kind of belonged together and were working with a shared sense of purpose, with a shared sense of context. And so this notion of smart autonomy, which I really like and came out of this book from Stanley McChrystal called Team of Teams, is about like, if you do have a shared sense of purpose, then teams can operate with that level of smart autonomy. And if that shared sense of purpose doesn't exist, then you're kind of going all off in every which way. And the other nice thing with this structure was that we were able to kind of create cascading goals. So we had a better sense of how all this stuff added up. So you would have goals set at the group level and then goals set at the team level. And the team goals would support those group goals. getting some bouncing here. Hold on a second. Let me just check one thing. I got a chat question. Yes, good. All right, awesome. Sorry about that. Just bouncing between these things. I highly recommend the book, especially if you're working in a company that's a little bit bigger. I read it probably the last couple of years I was at Etsy, and it was incredibly invaluable, just like shone a light on like how you get all these disparate teams working together in harmony. So I've been talking, when I first introduced like this core concept of squads, teams, groups and squads, and then I've been talking about teams, and so you're probably like, Jay, what's going on here? We have some namespace confusion. Well, that was a purposeful decision and adjustment that we made, because what we were observing was that when we had groups and teams, people's identity really stuck with the teams. And the teams, like from a structural perspective, kind of calcified. And the ability for the groups to adapt was limited, because the teams were much more fixed than we would hope they would have been. So say, for example, an opportunity arises, and maybe within a group, you kind of merge teams to work on that opportunity. It was harder just when we had that conception of teams. And so, and this was, I don't know if this predates when the video from Spotify came around, but we were just batting around terminology to use. And we had not seen the Spotify video. And we landed on squads. And why squads? Because it felt like it better conveyed people to coming together around a common purpose or a common goal and working to achieve something, but that those squads may reform and reconstitute over time. So there was a slightly more temporal nature, not temporal in the sense that we would reconstitute every week, but that squads could, and they did, exist for years or several months. And so when you go back to that structure, it's really like squads within the groups that represented current areas of investment. And again, driving more focus, greater resiliency because you're balancing durability and adaptability, and greater alignment because you have that shared sense of purpose, because you have goals that reinforce one another, and you're able to operate with a sense of smart autonomy. And so you may be thinking, well, that's great. Love the story about Etsy, but I don't work at Etsy. Or I work at a company that's not like Etsy. It's a different size, it's a different industry, it's a different phase of growth. I hear you. And I think one thing that, and why I was sort of excited to share some of these concepts, is that I've been able to apply them to different companies that are not like Etsy. They're a different size from Etsy, different phase of growth from Etsy, a different industry from Etsy. And the other thing too is that some of these concepts, and I'll ask Tim to weigh in when we get back to the Q&A, but some of these concepts, I was listening to a podcast with Josh Silverman, the CEO of Etsy, earlier this year, and he made reference to squads. So it sounds like to some extent it's still going. And so that sort of like the sustainability of the framework itself, I think is worth noting. So how about applying it to other contexts? So I'll start with Ibotta. So Ibotta is a Denver-based startup, probably around 600 to 700 people now. They make a shopping app that helps people save money on things they buy every day, from stuff in the grocery store to stuff online. And while I was there, I led the product team, which included product management and product design. And when I joined, it was a 300-person company with product development teams siloed by function. So we had 12 engineering teams organized around different areas of the tech stack. We had 9 analytics teams. We had 2 product management teams and 1 design team. And also there was little alignment across the company around who our primary customers were. If you would ask anyone, you'd probably get 4 different answers. And we would set goals that were sort of output oriented versus outcome. And what was really interesting is what I'd come in, and these different sort of functional groups, they all sat together, which is sort of antithetical to that notion of that cross-functional team as like the atomic unit of building things within product development. And this metaphor came to mind of needles and thread. And so the different functional teams represented needles. And the work to be done, the initiative or the outcome you're hoping to drive, was the thread. And to get it done, you had to thread all these needles. And the impact of that was that a given team, the only visibility they had into that initiative was the cross-section of the thread passing through the head of the needle. And so there was very little shared purpose, very little shared context. Goals weren't really shared. And the relationship between these teams was very transactional, because all you're doing is like passing thread through one needle to another. And so we wanted to fix that. And so what we did was basically apply the same framework and also use it as an opportunity to clarify some other things. So we clarified who our primary customers were. And then we organized cross-functional groups and squads, cross-product development around those primary customers, and then set outcome-based goals for those groups and squads. And so that's, I think, another thing to keep in mind too, is that how you organize your product teams can also help you bring clarity to other areas of the business. And that's what we were able to do here. Now with Artifact Uprising, it's a much smaller company, about 50 people, with a small product and engineering team, relatively speaking, responsible for a broad surface area. And when I joined, we just had one team. We had a team of engineers responsible for everything. And we kind of all know that, like, if you own everything, you kind of own nothing. And so what we did was we grew that team to the point where we could split into 2 squads. We're not big enough to have groups, but we can have squads. And we organized them around the customer journey. So we took that big, broad surface area and broke the customer journey into thirds. And so one squad has 1/3 of the customer journey, and the other squad has 2/3 of the customer journey. Sure, we want that one squad has a lot of focus, which is great. And one squad has more focus than I had before, but it's still, you know, fairly distributed. And our goal is to get to 3 squads. So what we're doing is hiring in to that squad that's looking after 2/3 of the customer journey. And once that gets to a sufficient level of scale, we'll subdivide into 2 squads. So then each squad is focused on 1/3 of the customer journey. I also wanted to share just some things to avoid, like, irrespective of how you're organizing teams. And these are all just, again, based on my learnings, for the most part, learnings during those 6 years at Etsy. I think the first thing to avoid is splitting yourself. If you find yourself, specifically like as a product manager, supporting 2 different teams, and both teams, squads, whatever you want to call it, are demanding the same amount of time and attention from you, you're not set up to be successful. And if you're in a position where you are staffing teams or structuring teams, and you have a PM in a situation where she's supporting 2 different teams, both requiring the same amount of time, she's not being set up to be successful. And so you always want to be asking yourself, like, am I doing the fewest things I need to do well to help us achieve our goals? And the likelihood of you being able to do something well when you're supporting 2 different teams goes down dramatically. And so if you're in that situation, raise your hand and say something. Now, there may be a case where you're focused on a couple different, say 2 different things, but one should really be the primary, where it's like 80% of your time, and the other should be the secondary, say 20%. And you should always be in a position where you can take that secondary down to 0, so you can avoid splitting yourself. Kind of related to that is just failing to right-size your ambitions, and maybe the ambitions of the company or the ambitions of the team, with the size of your team. And again, that gets back to that concept of what are the fewest things you, the team, need to do well to help your team, the company, achieve its goals. And this has often been the case where when I've been on teams and we've failed at driving the outcomes we've hoped driven, or where we've had hiccups and challenges, oftentimes it's because we haven't right-sized those ambitions to our team. And so another phrase I've used in the past is, what is the most impactful and achievable work that's worth doing that we can do with the team that we have. And kind of just like using that language really helps you make sure that you're right sizing, again, the ambitions to the team that you have. Because if they're mismatched, it's just a recipe for mismatched expectations. Another one is organizing in a vacuum. And I'd say like raise your virtual hand in the chat channel if you've ever been in a situation where another functional team, so say your product management, maybe engineering or design, goes through reorg and doesn't think that you have to be involved in it, or you don't think you have to be involved in it. And now raise your hand similarly if you and your functional group went through a reorg and didn't think that these other functional groups that you work with had to join with you, or they didn't think they had to join with you. And then I would say finally, like, raise your hand if any of those reorgs actually where those different functional groups weren't working in concert were actually successful. Because that was the experience for me while at Etsy. Every time that we went through an org change that didn't go well, the reason why it usually didn't go well was because one functional group was sort of organizing in a vacuum and not bringing everyone else along, or didn't think everyone else had to come along. Or one functional group was organizing in a vacuum and the others just didn't think it related to them. Well, lo and behold, because it takes people from different groups, engineering, product management, product design, to build great product experiences. It takes all those people, and if you're organizing just one in the vacuum, then the organizational structure that you come up with is gonna either be flawed or it's gonna take much longer for it to resonate with folks. Another big thing to avoid is overlap. And we had these pain points, and I'm sure Tim can speak to them as well. At Etsy, if you have groups or squads that are kind of responsible for the same thing, then you're bound to have overlap. You're bound to have folks stepping on one another's toes. And so if you see that, it really behooves you to raise your hand, say something, and make sure that overlap is clarified. It may be that you say, we have this overlap, and this is how we're going to divide it and split it, or this is how we're going to acknowledge that overlap and how we're going to create accountabilities. But when you have overlap, you don't acknowledge it. All it does is set up two groups, two squads to kind of be in conflict and to step on one another's toes. And to close, just a couple considerations that I think are not like directly related to how you organize product teams, but play a very related role, or both how you organize can support these, or if you don't take these considerations into effect or into account, it can create some challenges around how you're organizing product teams. And again, I mentioned this at the beginning, we're at the end of Q3, we're heading into Q4. A lot of folks, you're either in the midst of planning for next year, you've just kicked it off, you've already finished it. If you have, congratulations. Maybe you have an approach to continuous planning. But this model of groups and squads actually served us really well with our approach to planning while at Etsy. And we had an approach that, again, we iterated on it a bunch. We tried a lot of things that didn't work. We tried some things that eventually did work. And I think what did stick was this notion of a top-down and a bottom-up approach to planning. With that company-wide strategic direction, where are we going as a company? What do we hope to achieve? How are we going to measure our success along the way with the top-down component? And then the groups, given what they're responsible for, and that prompt of, well, what are the fewest things we need to do well to achieve our goals, given that strategic direction, generated plans, that was the bottom-up component. And so you can kind of see how this way of organizing product teams can pair nicely with strategic planning. And at least it did for us. And when we did kind of bring the two together, it was the first time during my time at Etsy that we ever arrived at roadmaps and budgets going into the next year on time, which is always a nice thing to have and is a tough thing when you're all the way through January and you don't know what your headcount allocation is going to look like. I think the last consideration to leave with is just making sure as much as possible that you're oriented around driving outcomes and not driving output, and how that feeds into the resiliency of how you're organizing your product teams. So take, for example, if you're organized around driving output and all that really matters is the work, we're going to launch the work, and say the work isn't going as well as it should, well, what do? You kind of scrap the work. And if you're organized around the work, then you kind of scrap the structure. But if you're organized around outcomes and those outcomes are strategically aligned, then the work is just a means to that end. And if the work is driving the outcomes you're hoping to see, great, carry on. If the work isn't, and you need to adapt, well, you can change the tactics. You can change the work that you're doing, but you're still oriented around driving outcomes. You're organized around driving outcomes. And so the structure and how you're organized doesn't necessarily have to change, because all you're doing is just changing a tactic versus what's truly core to yourself. So as much as possible, when you think about like, well, how do we create a resilient structure? How do we organize ourselves so we can adapt to change more nimbly? Being oriented around outcomes is really something that supports that. And being oriented around driving output is something that actually breeds brittleness within your teams, breeds fragility within the team and within the organizational structure. So I just want to leave with this last phrase of, as you go back to your companies, to your teams, take a moment to reflect, like, is the way that we've organized our product teams, our cross-functional product teams, does it help create focus? Does it help us adapt to change? And does it help us be more resilient in the face of constant change? And if it does, that's great. That's awesome. Share with me like what you've learned. And if it doesn't, I'm hoping some of the things that I shared with you, the learnings along the way, can help you get to that point where how you're organizing the team is helping create focus, adaptability, and resiliency within the face of constant change. So that's what I had to share. Thanks a bunch for listening, and I'll stop sharing and look forward to questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jay. So many great insights, so many that still resonate to this day at Etsy. So, lasting impact for sure. We've got about just under 20 minutes for Q&A. So two options: either drop your questions in the chat, or unmute yourself and just introduce yourself and ask your question.
This is Irene Chung. I'm a startup founder in New York City, and really appreciate the talk. I have a question about unknowns, and with smaller teams that cover a broad surface area, how do you incorporate unknown unknowns in the planning and organization process?
That's a great question. Thanks, Irene. I think, like, to an extent, irrespective of the size of the company and the team, there will always be unknown unknowns. I think what served me best is that concept of unknowns and unknown unknowns. I think it's like fairly well known within product development, but it's not it's folks outside of product development. So folks outside of your teams may be less familiar with it. And so kind of helping like set their expectations that perhaps like how much of what you're exploring, how much of what you're doing is known versus not, and what are like the potential unknowns out there, and just use that to set expectations with the team and with the broader company, if that makes sense, if that's helpful. Because if folks know like, hey, there are a lot of unknowns here, and we need to spend some time like gaining more confidence so that we have more certainty around how we want to proceed or the tactics we want to employ, then folks, I think for the most part, say like, oh yeah, I get it. Like, let's do that. We can't just like jump into something we have no idea about. But if that expectation isn't set, and then it comes back and it's like, wow, this like, we knew there were some unknowns, but we didn't necessarily vocalize that or share that more broadly, then people are surprised and like, oh, well, where did this come from? Now, I do think like the notion of unknown unknowns is an important one. And to an extent, like there's no getting around that. But the more that you share these concepts broadly and provide specific examples of them so that people who are less familiar with them can understand them and that resonates with them, then when they do arise, even with a small team, I think the expectations again are better set and better managed for folks. So this big unknown came up. All right, great. This is how we're going to stop, reflect, and tackle it. It's when people don't have the expectations that unknowns are out there or unknown unknowns are out there that everyone gets surprised. Does that help answer your question, Irene?
It does. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you.
I will use the awkward silence method. Eventually someone will have a question.
Tim wields that like a Jedi. It's the rare perfect presentation that just elicits no questions.
I'll buy it. So I work for a smaller startup. I'm a product manager, Chris, and I was looking at your slide that had a team of about 50 people. Everybody's responsible for everything. So that's sort of where we're at right now.
Yeah.
And I was interested that you broke it up by stages of the customer journey rather than by product areas or business lines.
Yeah, and I think I tried to get that across, but I'll say it here. How you break things up, to an extent, doesn't matter all that much. It's that they are broken up, and they're broken up in logical ways that it makes sense to folks. And that I think the most important thing, like when you break something up, and we went through this exercise at Etsy as well, because we had a lot of surface area, and we had a lot of products and features that were kind of unowned. Break it up in a way that everything can have a home. And most things will have a logical home, and some things won't, and that's okay. Again, just gets back to setting expectations. Like everything will have a home, most things will make sense, some won't, that's okay. You now own it, and with that ownership comes, I mean, you're responsible for it, but you also own it and you're empowered, so you get to decide what you're going to do with it. The customer journey example, so the way we did break it up, so with Artifact Uprising, I think the thing that makes it unique or a little bit different than sort of like a standard e-commerce experience is that you're spending a lot of time customizing the photo book that you're making, customizing the calendar that you're making. And so we kind of broke it up into thirds, and the first third was around what we just called discovering. We could have better words for that. But it's really everything from off Artifact Uprising to our product pages. So you're kind of like learning about us, discovering what you want, maybe finding what you want, discovering what you didn't know you wanted, and then evaluating and deciding, yeah, I want to make this thing. Then that middle third is make, and that's that customizing experience. And the back third is buy and receive, and that's everything from cart to post-purchase. And so I did phrase it as like customer journey, because that's one way to think of it. You could also say, well, these are just like ways of breaking up the product experience as well. But I suppose it just was the thing that came to mind most immediately, and it just seemed the most simple and straightforward. And I find I always try and default to simple and straightforward, because that means that the chance that it resonates with more people increases. And again, I'm just a big proponent of something that's broadly understood. I'd rather have something that's broadly understood, even if it's relatively simple, and that's probably a good thing, than less broadly understood. So it's still early days. We're really just like a month into it, but thus far, going this route has resulted in we're cutting meeting times in half. The velocity for the two teams, the two squads, has increased, and just morale on the team has increased, because I do have a better sense of ownership, and there's more camaraderie. So far so good. But again, to answer the immediate question, it doesn't really, you can organize it any which way. It's that you are creating an area of responsibility that makes sense for a lot of folks. And I would just add at the end, if it can help convey a concept that hasn't existed, that you want it to convey, leverage that as an opportunity. That was the Ibotta example. Again, we had like 20 different definitions of who our customers were. And I felt, and again, that was learning from Etsy, where like one of our more recent organizational changes helped clarify who our primary customers were. And so I saw this as an opportunity, not just to rationalize how we organize ourselves within product development within this company, but help clarify who our primary customers are for the entire company. And so think about like other things that you want to achieve, and how you organize teams can oftentimes help you achieve that as well.
I have a quick follow-up.
Sure.
So now, as you described that, so we sort of organize around projects, and it's making me wonder what you think about the importance of permanence in the squads. Does it have to be something that persists throughout quarters and years, or could it be something that's just for a quarter? Everyone's on a squad at one given moment.
Yeah, I think and that was the motivation for the name change between teams and squads, where it's like, no, I will not have this team merge with this other team. I refuse that. And so we found ourselves in a situation like human Tetris, which is just like you're sort of like pulling your hair out. And that's why squads had a little bit more flexibility as a term. There is value in creating long-lived teams, squads, high-performing teams. You get used to working with one another. You can start to complete your own sentences. You can do a better job of working in parallel. So there is value in that. But we certainly had situations where we would run something for the duration of, say, a given initiative, and then we would kind of ramp it down and then kind of reform. And so again, the model provided a level of adaptability. So in some cases, yeah, some of those squads would reform after, I would say probably like maybe 3 months was the shortest. But some would go on for multiple years, and there wasn't a hard rule. I guess the hard rule was that you were more nimble and adaptable. And based on new information that you were taking in, you would adapt accordingly. That helped answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks for the questions.
All right. Maybe that was awkward and long enough. I'll start to wrap up a little bit here. If you have any other questions in the next couple of minutes, definitely, just maybe ping it in the chat so we can interrupt the last little wrap up here. But few final things from me. We used to do this when we were in person, and it was always a ton of fun. But so we're bringing it back into the Zoom realm. And we call it shout outs. If you're looking for a job, if you're starting a business and you're looking for a co-founder, you're looking for customers, now is your time, kind of, 15 seconds of fame. If you want to pitch yourself, your company, or even if you're hiring, now is the time to unmute yourself and pitch yourself. And I will use a very cheap, selfish plug, and I'll lead with the shout outs. We are hiring a ton at Etsy right now. If you go to etsy.com/careers, we have a number of product roles open. Some are normally Brooklyn based, some are normally SF based. We're also, looking beyond those cities at the moment, given the current times. So if you're interested in working at a large, still very, very quickly growing e-commerce business, that's really grounded in a mission of keeping commerce human, take a look at the careers page, or feel free to ping me on LinkedIn.
Love it. It seems like we've got the first ever fully staffed, fully employed, no questions needed webinar audience of all time. I'm a Cubs fan. We had a no-hitter this week. It feels like I'm continuing that.
Yeah, awesome, guys. Thank you, and folks. Thank you all for joining. Final shout out from me. We have a talk next month from Kurt Williams, who is a director of customer product at Anheuser-Busch InBev. He was previously at The Knot, and he's going to be sharing some really interesting insights about working at big and small businesses, small and large. So join in, or tune in, I should say, on, let me get the date right, on October 21st. It's a Wednesday as usual, if you're interested in learning a little bit more from Kurt. And finally, you should have just received an email from us asking for your feedback. We're all product people. We want to make things better, want to improve. So if you have a few minutes, please give us some feedback about how we can make these sessions more impactful for you all. So thank you, Jay. Really appreciate you taking the time. And thanks to everyone else for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It's great talking.
Thanks, everyone.